If you're like me, you find throwing things away very satisfying. It's the decluttering, the clearing out, the starting fresh kind of feeling, you know? But where does our trash go? Like, what is away? And what about our recycling? My next guest is a zero waste consultant and executive director of Common Ground Compost, a New York organization dedicated to waste reduction through a zero waste program design, staff training, education, advocacy, collection, and of course, compost. Today, she's going to talk trash with me by explaining how trash and recycling really work, the socioeconomic dynamics in environmental causes, and of course, how we can be, well, less trashy. Garbage queen, trash nerd, my name twin, Meredith Danberg-Ficarelli. Hi, Meredith.
Hi, Meredith.
I'm so glad you're here. Did you know that we were basically destined to be planeteers? Like, our name means protector from the sea. Did you know this?
I did know that. It's a solid name.
It is, right? Like, thank you, Grandma. Okay, well, let's talk trash. So is it true that a head of lettuce in like my backyard in the ground would decompose in a few weeks, but a head of lettuce in a landfill would take 25 years to decompose?
That sounds about accurate. I am not a materials scientist, so I won't speak specifically to the amount of time that it would take a head of lettuce to break down in a landfill, which is an anaerobic environment or one without oxygen. It does depend a lot on the type of landfill that we're talking about, but for the most part, you're right. And one of the main reasons for that is oxygen. In your backyard, that head of lettuce will be in contact with oxygen and also with a variety of micro and macroorganisms that would chew it up and turn it into, what decomposers do, kind of breaking it down into its core components of different nutrients and minerals and all different kinds of things. In a landfill environment, you mentioned throwing things away earlier, and you did point to this. There is no away. Everything goes somewhere. And a landfill, the way I like to talk about it is that it's kind of like a big garbage lasagna in the ground where they can be very highly engineered or they can be much less formal. But generally, you're talking about adding materials over time to a pile. Sometimes it's dug into the ground with very well engineered layers that can filter material and make sure that the groundwater stays clean. Even in those cases, the way it's structured is as a bunch of cells, and each cell is filled over time. And between the layers is, it's called alternate daily cover, which can be made up of a lot of different things like construction and demolition debris or contaminated soil or crushed glass. But what's happening in each of those garbage lasagna layers is there's an environment completely void of oxygen. And getting to the point here, that oxygen-free environment is referred to also as an anaerobic environment. And a particular type of bacteria thrives in that environment. It's called a methanogen. And methanogens, when they digest organic matter, they produce methane as a byproduct of their digestion. So what we hear sometimes, especially in wealthier nations, is that landfills can produce energy. That's because the landfills are engineered to be able to capture that methane and use it to either create compressed natural gas or produce energy in another way. But an important thing to recognize is your head of lettuce is almost entirely water. And depending on how far away your landfill is, we're talking about transporting the water that's in that lettuce to potentially a far away landfill so that it can produce methane over time, when you could just keep it closer and compost it in your garden and not have to get rid of any of that water far away, in the first place.
Oh, okay. Whew, okay, I've learned so much already. Okay, so let me see if I can correctly summarize this. So generally speaking, landfills are suffocating, farting lasagnas. And yeah, that's it. That's all I got.
Pretty accurate.
Okay, great.
You might say they're burping.
Burping.
Cow
okay.
burps are what produce methane, not cow farts. That's another.
Okay.
Yeah, misconception.
Okay.
About
Blow
those
my
poor
mind.
stomachs that those cows have. Anyway, though, yeah, burping garbage lasagna pits.
Okay. And then you also said, well, it depends on what type of landfill. There's different types of landfills.
Great question. It depends on what part of the world you're in, for sure.
Okay.
There are different kind of regulatory standards for the types of disposal sites. So, the states have some standards and European nations have other standards. Other countries altogether might have standards, but enforcement isn't as good, or the availability of funding isn't great. Sometimes a landfill will just be a pile of waste somewhere. It's not necessarily an engineered hole in the ground. It's more of like an open dumping area. Sometimes there can be spontaneous combustion occurring in those places because of that methane that those methanogens are producing. Materials can spontaneously combust inside of a landfill, and then you end up with a landfill fire, which is no fun. So it's complicated.
Well, you know what? It's way more interesting than I ever thought. So, I mean,
It is.
I'm already.
It's also there's a major social justice element here, which I'm sure we'll get into later. But especially in poorer nations, frequently entire communities can subside only on the materials that are in landfills. Their jobs are essentially an informal process of gathering valuable materials from what others discarded. And that can even include feeding themselves from the materials that others have discarded. So there's a pretty massive spectrum of types of disposal when we talk about landfilling, and also, of the communities that surround those areas and how they're impacted by that infrastructure.
Yeah, that's a lot of variables. So that makes sense that there's different types. Not that there's like a menu that city council's picking from, but it's more like
Right.
different regulations and different socioeconomic dynamics in there. So let's talk about recycling. You've painted a good picture of how trash works, but a lot of us, pat ourselves on the back because, well, I put it in the recycling bin. So I was shocked to recently hear that only 40% of what we put in the recycling bin usually makes it to recycling. Can you kind of give us a more accurate picture of how recycling actually does work? How effective is it?
Yeah, this is a hard question.
I
There's
know.
another stat that came out recently that only 5% of the plastic ever produced has been recycled.
No.
It's unfortunate. So to zoom out for a second, when we talk about recycling, what we're talking about is circularity in the materials economy. So we talked a little bit about landfilling. We didn't really talk about incineration, which is an alternative to disposal that's still linear, where we mine natural materials, we make products, we buy the products, then we throw them away and they go somewhere, right? And where they go is to be determined based on all of these socioeconomic and political things that we talked about. Incineration is burning. So where landfill is burying, an incinerator or an incineration facility might be a really well-engineered facility, or it might be, again, an open pit where stuff is burned. Either way, though, we're talking about a linear system where there's an end, and then suddenly the stuff is just not going anywhere anymore. Whereas in a recycling economy, or in the economy that we as garbage people are trying to build towards a zero waste economy and a circular economy, we're taking the materials that we already have and we're recovering the value from those materials and making new things out of those materials. So at its core, that's what recycling is. There are a lot of different materials in the economy right now. Like if we think about paper versus plastic, it's, the recovery value there is different. The amount of resources that went into making those things is different. What those things are made of is different, right? So paper is made from trees and other living natural materials. You can make paper from hemp. Plastics are made from fossil fuels for the most part. And we are starting to make plastics out of plants as well. So there's a lot of complications there, even just in terms of the supply chains of those materials and the life cycle analyses of each of them. The challenge with plastic is multifold. There are a lot of different types of plastic, right? And each type of plastic needs to be recycled with like plastics. So if we think of a milk jug or a laundry detergent bottle, for example, the little number on the bottom is going to be a number 2, high density polyethylene or HDPE. That's a valuable, highly recoverable plastic. Whereas other plastics like a number 6 in the triangle or polystyrene can be harder to recover. Styrofoam, when you think about it, it breaks up into a million pieces. So when it's in a trash truck or a recycling truck and it gets smashed, it's unlikely that you're going to then be able to recover that value at a recycling facility, pack it up with all the other styrofoam and get it to a facility where it can then be melted down and turned into something new. So some of the challenges that we have with the recycling economy have to do with access to the services. So maybe you live in a place where there isn't a recycling economy because there aren't any facilities that can sort that material, which might have to do with politics. It might have to do with funding. It might have to do with a lot of different things. Then you also have just like the material itself. Different materials in that plastics recycling economy are easier or harder to recover because of the value of the material or the melting temperature of the material or how common it is for that material to be contaminated with food, for example. So again, lots of variables complicate the process. Culture and education and access to these services are a really, really big problem. In the United States, really depending on where you live, you may or may not have grown up in a culture of recycling, where your family, for example, even had access to these services. And that is a massive inequity that makes it really challenging once people move to a new city or start a new job. Suddenly, that new city or that new facilities and office managers' responsibility is to teach these people how to recycle, which is very challenging, especially because recycling infrastructure is municipal. So depending on where you live, the stuff that can be recycled is going to be different. There are communities where the recycling facilities have, you can bring your recyclables to drop them off, and there are like 25 categories of materials, different colored glasses and different types of plastics and textiles and all of these things. And it's totally normal to in your home separate your materials into that many categories and continue that process once you get to the next kind of step in that recycling supply chain at that facility. Whereas in other cases, it's like there's one recycling bin, no information, you just throw everything in the bin.
Yep, that's Escambia County, everyone. We don't know what we're doing.
Exactly. And it's, it's not your fault. Recycling is confusing. And what we end up with a lot of the time is what's referred to as wish cycling or aspirational recycling, where folks are holding on to something and they're like, this thing still has value. It's still usable. I'm going to recycle it without really recognizing that nothing is set up at the next step, on the back end to be able to recover that value.
I can see why people just throw it away. I mean, I can see why when they try to enter this space and, maybe hear a conversation like this, that their poor head is spinning. They're like, well, I want to do good, but I'm, working overtime because we're understaffed at our office because of, people, the Great Resignation or whatever. And they're like, screw it. I'm just going to do whatever. But I guess that leads to the question, like, how do you make people care about this? You do consulting work like waste analysis, waste audits for offices. Have you found that it's harder to engage companies since the Great Resignation when they barely have people to cover a shift, much less think about recycling?
Yeah, it depends on who you're talking to, on what the work is, on the company culture. Of course, folks who have 6 jobs and are just trying to get food on the table, might not have time to think about these things, might not care, might not have access to the information that they need. In working with companies, we're already kind of, they have self-selected to the point that they've reached out to us So there's already at least one person there who's interested in doing what we do or in getting guidance from us. So in that sense, I'd say we're lucky. But we have countless times offered proposals to companies and never heard back. They reached out to us for a reason. To speak to some of the other things that you were saying, there's definitely a spectrum of how to speak to different folks. Some people respond really well to background information, knowing how these economies function, recognizing that, to use composting as an example, the compost site is super close to where they live and employs local people, but the landfill is 6 states away and costs the city $450 million a year, right? Sometimes there are people for whom those economic basics make the difference. And they're like, I'm never putting anything in the trash can ever again, because I want to support my local economy. I want those local jobs. I want small government. I don't want my city spending a crazy amount of money shipping trash overseas. There are other people who respond really well to shame. Maybe they don't want to mention it, but they do, where it's like you see them, for example, putting a takeout container full of edible food straight in the trash can. And it's like, 40% of the food that's grown in the United States is wasted. And you are contributing 40%? To that problem. 40% of what we grow never makes its way to a plate. Refed is an organization that has done excellent research on this topic. That statistic is from 2017, so it might be a little bit out of date. But the point remains, significant waste happens even before food leaves the farm because of the cosmetic standards that we have in our supermarkets and through our very, very large food purchasing system. And then the majority of the waste actually happens in consumer-facing businesses and homes, about 80%, at least according to those statistics that were pulled in 2017. That was a major sidebar. That person with their food in that container, putting all of it in the trash can, telling them that, a ton of food is wasted, you're contributing to the problem. And if you just empty those food scraps into your compost bin and rinse out the container and put that in the recycling, you can at least contribute to creating the market signals that can help to increase demand for the services that we need. Granted that, example that I gave assumes that person has access to a compost bin and a recycling program, which not everyone does. So in other cases, it's speaking to the opportunities that folks have in a representative democracy to be able to call their representatives, call their city councilors, call their state legislators and say, why don't I have a recycling bin? Or why is recycling more expensive than trash, right? Mm-hmm. And that's another major issue here. Our country has disinvested in infrastructure for a very long time. So we are facing a huge uphill battle right now where municipalities are, for the most part, underfunded, or funding is disproportionately focused on non-social programs, things that don't help people, that encourage carceral systems and encourage wastefulness. And arguably, most of these things need to change. Point being, though, we have the ability to voice those concerns, even if it doesn't immediately create change. And you mentioned waste audits, and then I'll stop this bit of this ramble. Assessing waste is a really good way to understand behavior and to identify opportunities for change. So maybe there's a ton of contamination in that recycling bin. Knowing what the contamination is and why it's there can help us to shift that behavior over time.
And you mentioned social programs. That brings up an interesting thought. I'm sure you've seen the bumper sticker, like, save the baby humans, kind of implying like, hey, who cares about baby whales when we need to save the baby humans? So do you feel like poverty and environmentalism are separate or related issues?
Oh, they're very related. God, how many different things do I want to say right now? Okay, I think the clearest line here, although we do need a circular economy, not a linear one, is to speak to urban infrastructure and the mechanisms through which, especially waste infrastructure like transfer stations and materials recovery facilities, New York is my kind of base, so it's where my most direct experience is. But the way New York's waste infrastructure is cited was very intentional. The facilities that accept New York's waste and recycling are located in industrial neighborhoods where, especially at the time when they were being built and before and after, Black folks and low-income folks, people of color, indigenous people, didn't have options for where they could live. They were intentionally redlined or excluded from certain neighborhoods and had to coexist with this infrastructure that was being built and continues to exist. And that historic intentional placement of people with infrastructure has continued to to more negatively impact some communities more than others. So there is a disproportionate impact of waste infrastructure on marginalized communities, and it continues to this day. In New York City, more than 70% of the city's waste goes through just 3 neighborhoods, and that is, of course, unequal. And there is an effort through legislation, which is called waste equity legislation, to focus on reducing that harm by better distributing and arguably more equitably and more responsibly distributing that infrastructure across other communities. But we know how long it takes to build new infrastructure. So this harm continues. And one of the things that we can do is reduce waste. By reducing the amount of waste that we produce as individuals and as a society, we can gradually reduce that harm while we also work to change the systems and structures that caused it in the first place.
You lived in Beirut, Lebanon for a while. I am curious to hear what your observations were between really the American wealth and its relationship with waste, and more like international wealth and its relationship with waste or lack of wealth, because I feel like that presents differently potentially in the United States versus other places. Just from my experience traveling, when I went to Nicaragua, the owner of the hostel had very serious talk with us about the water and also recycling the water bottles. Like we had, there was like water to drink and then water to bathe. And I think it's because we were American, like he met us at a restaurant unexpectedly and was like, listen, you can mess with my food, you can waste my whatever, but if you waste my water, I will come after you. And he really, like, it was a matter of like his livelihood, because they had to truck the water in, carry it to the top of a tower, and then gravity fed the water through, and that was like our shower. So it was a very serious. So I'm just curious what your observations, especially because of your professional experience, America to other places.
We obviously need to have 7 more of these conversations to get through all of these questions at a time.
Right.
I'm glad you're talking about water. One of my favorite things about the work that I do is that waste sustainability is intersectional. Waste is intersectional. Waste comes from everywhere. Everyone produces it. So it really touches everything. Lebanon is a crazy place. It is a particularly interesting example of kind of the dichotomy between wealth and poverty. There are incredibly wealthy people in Beirut and also very intense poverty, and you can see them together. Similarly to what you're talking about, major water issues there, huge issues with electrical supply. The waste system when I was there was a monopoly from one company. I won't get into the politics there, but they're complicated if people want to look into them. That was a really horrible attempt at a wink. I'm actually way better at that than it seems.
Just for the podcast listeners, you have to go wink, wink, like say it, like right. Narrate yourself.
I shall do that next time. The major issue that happened just after I left Beirut actually was that that monopoly contract with that one waste company ended / was ended early / political corrupt complications. And all the collections stopped and waste started piling up in the streets. Waste started being dumped in the river. It shows the fine line between systems that function and systems that don't function. I think it also speaks to this question of culture and access. Some folks who I was friends with would never think of tossing a bottle into the woods and being like, well, it's not my problem, while other folks would do that on the regular. And that, I think, there are people in the States and people in Lebanon and people all over the world who kind of fall into one or the other of those buckets. And I think, rather than kind of critiquing one place or another, to speak more to solutions, I think part of what needs to happen is we need more people engaged in the recovery of value. And that might look like moving back in the direction of glass bottles being reusable and refillable instead of disposable. Glass bottles are very common. They are not only highly recyclable, but incredibly durable if we can sanitize them and refill them and reuse them. And what that would look like is a relocalization of economy. Instead of beer bottles being filled halfway across the world and shipped to us to consume in our homes so that we can toss them out, what we're looking at might be distribution facilities and washing infrastructure that is much more localized. So that's just a really tiny example. But I do think that some similar solutions can apply regardless of where we are in the world.
That's a really fascinating perspective. I didn't expect you to say that, but you're right. People are nuanced no matter where you're at. And if, pointing the right kind of finger at them or ourselves is maybe not the most helpful approach. So that's a perfect segue into solutions. I really am curious about how an individual would begin to compost. What does composting look like for the average city dweller?
Yeah, it totally depends on where you live. Some cities like Toronto or Austin have municipally funded organics collection services. So a resident would have a bin on their countertop. They're prepping their food. They put their scraps, which is pits and peels and stems, maybe the stray moldy piece of bread, although use your bread, don't let it get moldy, bones, in most cases in this kind of larger municipal scale. Those things then just get collected at the curbside, or maybe there's a drop-off location where folks bring them, which helps improve the transit efficiency for that municipality to only collect from drop-off hubs instead of every individual's home. New York City has been working on a similar model. In places where folks don't have access to a municipally funded service, maybe they're composting at home. And one of the big differences here is what can go into the bin. If we're home composting, we might only be putting fruits and veggies, kind of like vegan compost, with eggshells if people eat eggs. Whereas I mentioned bones and meat and dairy in the municipal system, anything that was once alive can be composted, but the type of system, the type of composting process will dictate what can go into that particular system for a number of different reasons. It might be because the compost pile is in a residential neighborhood and rats really like meat and dairy. So keeping them out of the bin, can help to keep the neighbors happy. It also has to do with the biology within that compost pile. There are macroorganisms and bacteria and microorganisms consuming those food scraps in the presence of oxygen. So unlike a landfill, which is anaerobic, composting is aerobic. And what happens during the digestion process with all those little bugs, they produce heat. And that heat is kind of what sanitizes the compost. So in the same way that we breathe and produce heat as a byproduct, same thing's going on, but at a much smaller scale, microscopically. And that heat will reach a different peak temperature. I'm modeling a parabolic curve with my hand right now. That peak temperature will be different depending on the type of compost process, the size of the compost facility, and the inputs. So if we're at home, we might be replicating a composting process at a smaller scale because we're obviously producing much less waste than an entire city. And, access is a challenge too. You might want to compost at home, but you live in an apartment. You might not have access to the carbon material, the browns, which are like dried leaves and yard waste that you need to create that kind of ideal aerobic environment for that material. Check out community gardens. Check out micro haulers, small scale, small businesses that can collect your food scraps for you. You can look up bokashi fermentation composting, vermicomposting, which uses worms. There's a process called the Japanese box method. There are a lot of ways that we can compost at home. And the last note I'll say is before composting, try to use the food. So your freezer is your friend, right? Freeze food that might go bad. If you have like random fruits like once a week and like one of the berries is like a little mushy or whatever, throw it in a jar in your freezer. And when the jar's full, make a smoothie, right? Even the tiniest things can add up. And you can also save money that way.
Yeah, I'm about that. Tell me about the software that Common Ground is creating to help with composting and...
Yeah, so thank you for asking. Common Ground Compost has produced a software product called Watts, which you can go to getwatts.com to learn about it. And it is focused on businesses and how business operations can shift to better understand the waste that they produce and how they can reduce waste over time. So it's really focused on the internal, like inner workings of businesses and teaching them how they can work towards waste reduction over time and track that progress, report on those diversion statistics and carbon emissions and do their own waste audits, all those things. And we're launching this summer. So we're pretty psyched about it.
Oh, that is exciting. I like the idea that the value of that could be measurable for those who don't see the bigger picture value. That's really cool.
Yeah, and it's important now, now more than ever. I hate that. You also asked earlier about like COVID and return to office. One of the big things that we're finding is some businesses have really doubled down on their sustainability initiatives, and it's become even more important. The Securities and Exchange Commission is potentially starting to require businesses to report on their environmental and social governance programs or ESG programs. And waste is part of that. Being able to identify the associated emissions that relate to waste and the waste that businesses produce. The more these reporting requirements are laid out and required of businesses, the more important it's going to become for businesses to be able to measure these impacts. And while water and energy are kind of easily meterable at this point, especially in like your standard commercial office building in New York City, waste is a totally invisible place. It's
Interesting.
Usually like a guy named Bob who has to get called on the radio. Somebody's like, Bob, how much trash did we have last month? And Bob has to like look up a spreadsheet on his computer. So we're building software.
Oh, God bless.
We're in the 21st century.
God bless Bob and Watts. That's very exciting. Okay, before we sign off.
Thank you to all the Bobs out there.
Thank you to the Bobs. Before we sign off, I have some rapid fire questions. But you know what? I have something else that's top of mind that I have to ask you because I'm afraid I'll forget. The rumor is that I'm a full-grown adult. It's mostly a rumor, but the problem is I still don't know what to do with my used batteries.
I hate this question.
I'm sorry.
What I want to say is different from like what's printed on the package, which is a lesson in itself. Don't always trust the packaging. Companies that make things are the ones that make us have waste in the first place. Think about that. Maybe rewind that and play it again. The only reason we have trash is that companies make things that we buy and then we end up with the waste. And then we and or our municipalities become responsible for the cost of that disposal, which is a fucking outrage. Companies need to be responsible for the shit that they give us, that we end up with. So extended producer responsibility is all about this. look it up. Again, call your representatives. There is legislation at the federal level right now supporting this. It's all over Europe. Anyway, batteries. The standard like AA batteries don't have mercury in them anymore. So the messaging is actually, you can put them in the trash. The argument there is they won't have a negative impact in the landfill. My perspective here is there's stuff in those batteries that had to get pulled out of the earth at one point. And I'd rather not just bury them in a landfill, or God forbid, send them to an incinerator where the dioxins and all kinds of other potential pollutants that might happen from burning that material, if the facility is not up to snuff, might impact the communities that live nearby. There are battery mailback programs. Some big box stores take batteries for recycling. There are local electronics recycling drop-offs. So check all of those out. And most importantly, lithium ion batteries can be really dangerous. So make sure that any product that you have in your home that have lithium ion batteries in them, if it's like your trash drawer, like take the lithium ion batteries out of your trash drawer and figure out where to deposit them for recycling, because they can spontaneously combust. They can be really dangerous. So do a check real quick. Again, it's not your fault. They're like sneakers have batteries in them now. So, like we humans aren't doing ourselves any favors these days, I'll say.
Oh my gosh. Okay. So my rapid fire questions for you, really it's one question, maybe rapid fire answers, but is what are the R's that we're missing? We know reduce, reuse, recycle from, elementary school, but what are the R's that we're missing from that equation?
Yeah, it's a long list, and it's probably longer than what I'll say, but rethink is one of them. So like extended producer responsibility is kind of that, or seeing where our opportunities to maybe consume less, like rethink, right? Refuse is a really good one. And that's basically just like, whether it's individual responsibility to like not take the freebies, or maybe again, refusing to consume more than what we might need if that's a choice for us. And reusing and repairing are other really good ones. They're different, but I kind of speak to them in a similar way. Continuing to find value in what you have. If folks aren't already aware of the Buy Nothing Project and the Buy Nothing groups that exist in their communities, these are mostly run through Facebook, but Buy Nothing is a nonprofit organization where you can share with your neighbors. If you have kids, it's a really good way to share clothes and toys. It's a great way to find new furniture if you're moving. People share everything. Plant cuttings. You can propagate your entire house plant jungle just out of propagated stems from your Buy Nothing group. So engage in your local communities. I know that's not an R, that's like an acronym more like, but there's way more to it than just, reduce, reuse, recycle. And there's kind of space in those R's for everyone.
I like that a lot, especially the refuse. It's kind of cutting it out on the front end. I feel like the R's of refuse, and what was the other one that you said?
Was it rethink maybe?
Rethink and refuse, I feel like are the anti-overwhelm of waste reduction, because you nip it in the bud before it even gets to your house. So when you're at DSW, folks buying shoes with batteries in them, and they're like, here's your free bag, and you don't need a free bag.
You don't need the bag.
Just go, no, thank you. Plus, it's super entertaining to watch their facial, expressions when you say no, thank you. They are
don't want
so
the free thing?
Yeah, they're so confused, and it's a little fun. It's a little fun. I won't lie. This has been
also like buy secondhand. That's a really big one. Try to shift a little bit. Secondhand, thread up. What?
Yay!
Yeah. So they're baby steps though. Don't be overwhelmed. Take your time getting into this. Do your research, and when in doubt, throw it out. We don't want to contaminate the recycling stream. So if you're not sure, do not wish cycle. Put the thing in the trash and then try to find ways to not have that thing again in the future.
Love it. Thank you so much. Tell everyone where they can follow your organization on social media.
Common Compost on Instagram and Common Ground Compost everywhere else.
Awesome. This has been great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Meredith. It's been lovely.
Hey, you're still here. That's awesome. Hope to see you next week, too. I talk with the most interesting people that you've probably never heard of. Most of them are paradoxical and bring an opportunity for you to grow as a person. So if you like bright, meaningful entertainment, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell for notifications.